Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni moli wanji, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jadley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so honored that you join us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the podcast. Please tell your kids' teacher, their principal, their librarian, and also please subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, Stitcher Radio, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Cynthia and Sanford Levinson. They are here to celebrate fault lines in the Constitution. Before we invite Cynthia and Sandy into the studio, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by The Adventures of Harry and Friends, the absolutely wonderful picture book series by Sarah Belisa Tucker. Are you tired of asking your child to pick up their toys, like, all the time? If you answered yes, then you absolutely want to pick up a copy of Harry and the Broken Toy. It's book number 4 in Sarah Belisa Tucker's 7-book series. It's wonderful. The entire series is wonderful, and it will inspire your kids to use their imagination, to develop their moral compass, gives them real-life examples, and helps them prepare for the many challenges they're going to face. The books are available on Amazon and also at theadventuresofharryandfriend.com. Join us right now from the lovely town of Brookline, right outside of Boston, Massachusetts. Our guests today are here to celebrate a really wonderful and really important book, too. The name of the book is Fault Lines in the Constitution. Please welcome to the show Cynthia and Sanford Levinson. Hey, Cynthia, how are you?
Good, thank you. We're doing just very well. We appreciate your asking. I'm glad to hear you are too.
Yes. I'm excited to have you on. Cynthia and Sanford are living not so far from where I grew up in beautiful Whiskey Point neighborhood of Brookline. Sandy, it's really wonderful to have you on. First, you are known as writing many articles and books for adults. Before we ask about fault lines, what was the experience writing this book for kids for you?
Cynthia wrote it.
Okay.
That was the fundamental experience. We worked together, but she wrote it.
Mm-hmm. Well, since you are getting all the credit for writing, Cynthia, why don't you tell us about fault lines in the Constitution?
Well, I will, but first I want to say Sandy's being entirely too modest. Not only did I keep a number of words like a and the from Sandy, but really, more seriously, he's been thinking and writing about this topic, fault lines in the Constitution, for at least 25 or 30 years. And if your listeners just think a little bit about the title of the book, fault lines is typically a geological term that refers to structural problems in the earth and the ground. And if there's slippage along a fault line, a geological fault line, then there can be catastrophe. Not only can, roads fall apart and buildings fall down, there can be tidal waves that come as a result from the ocean. So the title of the book, which was really suggested by our editor, Kathy Landwehr at Peachtree Publishers, indicates that there are similarly possibly devastating structural problems with the foundation of our government. The foundation of our government is based on the Constitution. And as Sandy has been thinking and writing about, as I say, for a number of decades, there are problems there which cause issues for us ever since and ongoing.
Mm-hmm. Sandy, as I'm listening to Cynthia, and I agree that there's nothing that has been created by man that's perfect. One of the things that I'm thinking about is just the idea, to suggest the idea that there's a problem with the Constitution sends some people into a rage. And we're at a point in our time in history where it seems as though we're incapable of having conversations that can hopefully make the country a better place.
Yeah, you certainly may be right in your second observation. With regard to the first, there's an interesting history. And even if you look at the present, the history is that it used to be possible to talk about defects in the Constitution. I have often written that my favorite presidential election was the 1912 election, because in Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt, and for that matter, Eugene V. Debs, you had really serious constitutional reformers who were suggesting that we needed to bring the Constitution into the then 20th century. And their opponent was William Howard Taft, an extraordinarily capable defender of the old order. And so when Taft got routed in the election, it was a statement in part that, we the people were willing to listen to serious critiques of the Constitution. And in that decade, there were 4 substantial and important amendments to the Constitution, including women's suffrage, the change of the Senate from being appointed by state legislators to being elected by the electorate in general. That's gone. So I contrast 1912 with 2012, when the former president of the Harvard Law Review, Barack Obama, never gave a single interesting speech about the Constitution. And his opponent, Mitt Romney, has also gone to the Harvard Law School, and he never gave an interesting speech about it. So what you say is true, but it's not historically true. So one of the things that has to be explained, and we don't have enough time certainly to go into it, is what accounts for this very dramatic difference in public tone over the last 100 years. But the second thing, and this a little bit contradicts what I've just said, is that there's a story on, I don't know if it's page 1 of the New York Times or not, but it's a prominent story in today's, that is the Labor Day issue of the New York Times, on how political conservatives are mobilizing to have a new constitutional convention. And, I can say Cynthia and I split our time between Austin, Texas, and Boston. And the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, in 2016, published what he called the Texas Plan for constitutional revision. It called for a new constitutional convention and proposed 9 quite dramatic changes to the Constitution we now have. It is basically, frankly, political liberals who get extraordinarily nervous whenever anybody suggests that we should think of significant constitutional reform. But political conservatives who, on the one hand, are committed to a cult of the founders, on the other hand, they're actually actively working for what they view as constitutional reform.
This is a fascinating time, and you have obviously studied this in depth. I'm amazed that, Cynthia, you were able to take this wisdom and turn it into a book that's accessible for young people. What's the trick for that?
Well, every chapter, and let me give an example. Every chapter of the book opens with a story. So Sandy and I, we deal with, golly, I don't remember now, 15 fault lines?
20.
20, okay, good for us. And possibly more to come. We deal with 20 fault lines. We have a somewhat different opinion about what we each think the biggest fault line is. But just to give your listeners an example, I think that the Senate itself, which is certainly a part of the structure of our government, is the most problematic issue with our Constitution. I think Sandy might point to, he mentioned amendments a moment ago, he might point to the difficulty of amending the Constitution. And that really relates to the question you were just asking, constitutional change. It's either, something massive potentially, or, amending it. But as Sandy points out, it's very hard to do that. In any case, every one of these chapters starts with a story. That makes it all very accessible. The story about amendments actually has to do with how an amendment was stopped, and it wasn't so hard to make that happen. Sandy, what's our story for the Senate chapter? I'm trying to remember now. I think it's about the budget for farmers, really.
Or it could also, the book as a whole begins with why there was no federal anti-lynching bill until literally, I think, earlier this year. Right. But the first one was proposed and supported by a Republican member of Congress from St. Louis, and it was supported by Warren Harding, who usually gets no credit for being, even a halfway decent president. But on this issue, he was more than halfway decent. And it didn't go anywhere because of the Senate. The Senate was controlled, as was the case into our own lifetime, that is the 1960s, by racist Southern Democrats who could use their disproportionate power in the Senate to prevent any such bill even from coming to a vote. They didn't have to vote it down. What they did was to engage in the filibuster. So we talk about that, and the expression that one often hears that the Senate is where progressive legislation goes to die. Now, there are some exceptions to that, but over the 235-year history, the adage is more or less true. And today it is especially true because the Senate is so warped in terms of who gets more representation. So, Vermont's two senators, Bernie Sanders and Pat Leahy, have the same two votes as Texas's senators, Ted Cruz and John Cornyn. I will be very quick to say that I much, much prefer Sanders and Leahy to Senators Cornyn and Cruz, but there is no other reason to justify Vermont with 650,000 people having the same two votes as Texas with 28 million people. And then one looks at specific issues like coal, and one discovers that coal is disproportionately mined in relatively small states. And, you want to know why Joe Manchin was able to block even more ambitious environmental reform? It's because he's from West Virginia, historically a coal-producing state. Wyoming is another coal-producing state. Montana, Kentucky is a little larger, but it's not that big. And their senators are fanatically committed to the interests of the coal industry.
And how to make this relevant to kids, there are also the northern, middle western states, which have, as Sandy's pointing out, very low population, but there are about 5 of them. There are 10 senators from those states, and they are able to increase funds for their constituents, many of whom are farmers, many of whom grow corn. So how does this relate to kids? Well, the United States, thanks to the subsidies for corn farmers, produces so much corn that corn oil and other corn products show up every place, including in school lunches. So we tell the story about the background for how the corn lobby works. Then we show how it affects kids. Then we take a broader picture and show, for instance, what Sandy's saying, how the Senate affects not only school lunches and kids' diets, which is directly related to obesity, but then also to larger issues like the environment. We also explain, how did we get here? What happened in 1787? What were the debates among the framers? The subtitle for the book, by the way, is The Framers, Their Fights, and the Flaws That Affect Us Today. Mm-hmm. So what fights did the framers have, and what compromises did they make with each other in order to come up with 2 senators from every state, regardless of size? So we go into that. We also, and Sandy was really on top of this a lot, how do state constitutions differ from the national constitution? So kids can look up to see, oh, I live in Wyoming, or I live in Nevada, or, Maine, whatever. What is my constitution? How does it differ, if at all, mm-hmm. from all of these national constitutional issues? And then we end up with, well, what, if anything, can be done mm-hmm. about it? And what can kids do about these issues? So that's how we tried to make it interesting to kids.
Were you going to say something, Sandy?
Yeah, that, Cynthia's point about corn is extremely important because small states by definition have fewer major interests than large states do. I mean, California and New York are both clearly agricultural states in very important ways. But it's also the case that the senators from California and New York have to think about very large cities, the urban realities. And so they're balancing off interests. Whereas if you're from the Dakotas or Iowa, then corn is going to be at the head of your list of interests. And it really doesn't matter whether you're Democratic or Republican. I mean, one of the things you can say about Bernie Sanders and Pat Leahy is that both of them like the dairy industry mm-hmm. because there are a lot of cows in Vermont. And also Sanders, until he started running for president, was a fairly faithful servant of his constituents who like guns. And, because of the nature of Vermont, there's a lot of hunting in Vermont. And so this transcends kind of normal partisan divisions. It can be true that some small states have Democratic senators and others have Republican senators, but they're united in some ways around real devotion to the relatively few interests that their state has, unlike the wildly multiple sets of interests that you find in the larger states.
Yeah. This is really fascinating for me, but it's also really fun for me because I'm interested obviously I'm interested in our nation and how it's governed and what we can do together to make it a more wonderful, more perfect union so that everybody can be happy and successful. But we're not, it seems like it's very difficult to have these kind of conversations without there being a whole lot of political partisanship and battling going back and forth. And so to be able to sit down and listen to two people who are obviously very knowledgeable about this subject, and I think looking at it from a very fair perspective. It's not something that you see on cable news. So I'm delighted that I'm having this conversation with you. Cynthia, I'm curious. You mentioned that one of the things that fault lines in the Constitution does is it gives families some ideas of things that kids can do to change the Constitution or get the process started. What are some of those things?
Well, whether they can change the Constitution, I don't know. As Sandy would say, it's really, really hard to do that. But kids can actually do what we're doing right now. They can talk. They can talk about the issues. They can listen to each other and different people's perspectives. They can become more aware and knowledgeable of the effects of what happened in 1787 for today. So there's a tendency, I think, and I fall into this tendency also, to blame particular people for problems politically today. Well, our elected officials are simply responding to the arrangements that they have to work with, the power arrangements that they have to work with. So if kids become aware of those authority structures, then they may become more sympathetic or empathetic with the problems. And that could be at their school. It could be in a club that they belong to. Probably there are lots of organizations that they join that actually have a constitution. They might want to take a look at it and see how it's affecting what they're doing. In terms of the bigger picture, they could look at their state constitution, although many of them are just horrendously long. But we also refer to a young man actually who was at the University of Texas, where Sandy teaches part of the year, who really did bring about an amendment to the Constitution. He noticed that an amendment had been a part of what's now called and is the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. Initially, there were more of them that were proposed, and one of them had to do, is this right, Sandy, with the salaries, of raising the salaries of members of Congress, that it shouldn't be done when somebody's in office. And he actually, this young man, lobbied for something like 20 years and got that amendment passed. So kids, if they really get riled up about something, they could find out how to get amendments passed. We also just say, speak up. Think about the issues. Pick an issue that you are concerned about. There may well be, as Sandy says, environmental issues. Many kids, understandably, unfortunately, are concerned about gun control. That, too, of course, relates to the Constitution. If they have views, speak up about it and learn how changes might be effected. Sandy and I also write a blog every month or two. Kids just reading our blog. And what we do is we show how constitutional issues are related to today. They could read our blog and have discussions about that in school or with their families.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love the idea of kids reading your blog, kids reading fault lines in the Constitution and having those conversations within the family. That's one thing that really energized my family, is talking about these kind of issues with both my son and daughter, who are now adults, and being able to disagree on something or seeing things in different perspectives. And having a conversation and disagreeing, and at the end of the conversation, hey, we still love each other, and we can sit down and have dinner together, and no one wants to hurt each other. No one is going to stop talking to one another. And I think that that's such an important lesson for us to teach our kids. And I think it's the only way that we can move forward as a nation.
Now, let me say one thing about that in the context of our book. Most of our book, not all of it, but really and truly most of it, is about structures. It's not about constitutional rights. That reflects my own insistence now over many years that the structural provisions are really in some ways more important than the rights provisions. Though one of the realities after World War II is that people started identifying the Constitution almost exclusively in terms of what rights it did or did not protect. And the structural provisions, beginning with the Senate, say, or the difficulty of amending the Constitution, or bicameralism, or fixed 4-year terms, they are treated as dull and boring issues, mechanical issues, whereas the really interesting issues are issues about rights. Mm-hmm. And we want to argue that that's false. It's not that rights provisions aren't interesting and important, they are, but that the structural provisions are also incredibly important, and they tend to be ignored. And my own view and actually experience has been that the structural provisions are much less likely to generate shouting at one another than the rights provisions. I mean, if you announce around the dinner table, we're going to talk about abortion, or we're going to talk about guns, or affirmative action, or hate speech, then it's very likely that people are going to start shouting at one another within a few minutes. But if you say, let's talk about the presidential veto, should the president have a veto at all? Or even if you think the president should have a veto, should it be so incredibly difficult to override presidential vetoes? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that the state we live in, whatever the state is very likely to have a different form of veto system. Some of them give governors more power, but also make it easier for legislatures to override vetoes. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people will think this is dull and boring. Why can't we talk about guns? But in fact, you start pointing out that what the veto means is that legislation that can get through Congress, which is no easy matter given bicameralism, can still be stopped. It can be killed by a presidential veto pen. And is that a great idea? Unless you're talking about a bill before Congress right this minute, it's not going to be a partisan issue. You're going to find yourself talking much more soberly, much more in a modulated tone about what sort of presidential power you want in 2028 mm-hmm. or 2032. And you can march through this whole list of problems. And, even with regard to the Senate, if you're talking about the future, then you could still have, I think, a very modulated discussion, except perhaps with somebody from Vermont or Wyoming. And they're going to pound the table and say, well, if you don't give us 2% of the vote in the Senate, then we're just going to be ground under mm-hmm. because quite obviously the percentage of the population is a very small fraction even of 2%, let alone of 100%. Mm-hmm. But, if you're not from Wyoming or Vermont, we could have a serious talk. And I think at some level, we could go well into dinner without necessarily pounding the table or being identifiable as a liberal or conservative, a Democrat or Republican.
Yeah. I love that idea. And I love the idea of sitting down with our kids and helping them understand that you have to look beyond the headlines, to look beyond the screaming and the shouting, and look at how our country operates and start talking about that. And I love, Sandy, the idea of just talking about the structure so that we're able to talk and how do we want to move forward. And I think this is brilliant. And I love the fact that fault lines in the Constitution is available for families. I love that it's available as in a narrative form, and it's also available as a graphic novel. Am I right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, the graphic novel is a lot of fun. And so, it gives families, kids, teachers, a lot of options on how to, approach these issues, visually, textually. I mentioned the blog. Our blog for August, this past month, was on compromise, on the issue of compromise. That is something that's a topic that affects all families. Everybody wants something different often within a family. If you talk about it, as Sandy was saying, in a neutral way, if it's sort of dispossessed of the particular issue of, are we going to go to the park, or are we going to go to take a hike, or, whatever, how do we compromise it? If you take it at a more dispassionate level and look at some of our other blogs, they really are, they can be conversational. Mm-hmm. And thinking about a family sitting around a table, reading a story that from the narrative version of the book, that can be very engaging. Or a kid holding up the pictures and turning the pages of the graphic novel version. That can also be involving really across a wide age range.
Yeah.
Both of them.
And one of the neat things about a graphic novel, and we celebrate graphic novels here a lot, is that it's so much more accessible for kids who tend to be reluctant readers to get into a graphic novel. And there's some pretty meaty information in fault lines in the Constitution. And I think those kids that, are reluctant readers who have lots of ideas and can be easily distracted, they're kids who have lots of ideas, and they may be the ones that can solve some of these problems. And getting them engaged in the conversation through a graphic novel, I think, is a wonderful thing and can just help move us forward.
Yeah, it has a great sense of humor. There's a very wry tone to the graphic novel.
Awesome.
Fun.
Hey, Cynthia, tell us, please, where we can go to find out more about all of the other kids' books that you've created.
Oh, thank you. So my website is CynthiaLevinson.com. My books are there. I used to write articles, and many of the articles that I wrote for kids magazines are there. There's an About Me, and there's also I always have a lot of primary source information, background information about my books, text and audio and visual and moving video. So teachers, parents, kids can get into that. So CynthiaLevinson.com. Thank you.
And Sandy, is there a place where people can go to find out more about you and maybe see if you decide that you're going to write a picture book in the future?
Yes and no. I don't have a website. But actually, there is a blog site that might be relevant. It's called Balkanization. You can get it just through that, BalkinIzation, but it's also Balkan.blogspot.com. It's named after my friend Jack Balkan, who teaches at the Yale Law School. This is the 20th anniversary year of it. It happens to be the case that this year, in part because this is my 40th year at the University of Texas Law School, some colleagues have organized what they call a Levinson Fest, in which a number of panels are being organized to discuss various and sundry interests of mine. And so, in fact, two of them are going up in the next week or two. The one that is currently, that is Labor Day, I assume your listeners will be listening after Labor Day, but the one that is currently going up is called Can the Constitution Be Saved? And it's all about the issue of constitutional reform. There's a terrific set of participants. I think there are 7 or 8 papers that run a good gamut from, yes, we need really to have a new constitutional convention, which I support, to don't even think of it, and the like. And then I follow that with what turned into an 8,000-word response to the various papers. And the one that will follow that sometime next week or in 2 weeks is one on comparative constitutional law, which is a big interest of mine. So, I would commend that to your listeners, not simply if they're interested in learning more about the way I think, but because it really is a very good dialogue among people who may or may not agree with me, but it really is a very civil and illuminating discussion about these issues.
Sandy, do you want to mention the Constitution Project?
Yeah, that's a good idea. In 2020 and 2021, I chaired a project that was initiated by Michael Tomasky, who's the editor of the journal Democracy, and he's now, in addition, the editor of the New Republic. And he asked me to find a number of people who would have a kind of mock constitutional convention and try to design a constitution for the 21st century. And Zoom, frankly, ended up being a godsend. We could not have done it without the pandemic because it meant that people were stuck in their homes, and Zoom made it possible for us to meet very, very frequently and have very intense discussions and debates. And we ended up drafting a constitution that has some very interesting, very controversial features. And it was published in the summer 2021 issue of Democracy. One can also find it online quite easily. But that, and I have a long introduction explaining the project and explaining the fact that I didn't necessarily get my way. We had votes, and I lost a number of votes. I thought, for example, talking about the Senate, that if we stick with something like the current Senate, which I would gladly change much more radically, but if we do stick with something like the current Senate, then each of the largest American cities, Houston, LA, Chicago, New York, obviously, should have a senator of its own, rather than be at the mercy of the anti-urban parts of the state that are very important, say, in Texas. I think it's a very sensible proposal. It went down. But it does illustrate the challenges of constitutional design, and frankly, the fact that any constitution will have to have a lot of compromises, and many of them will be unhappy compromises. In fact, again, this is Labor Day when we're having the conversation. Yesterday in Chile, a brand new constitution with something I think like 330 different clauses was voted down by 60% of the public. And it simply illustrated the fact that the people writing the Constitution were much too ambitious. And frankly, it's much easier to rally opposition to a complex document than support, because all I have to do is persuade you that there are one or two really bad features to get you to vote against, whereas to get you to vote for, you have to agree either that everything is really quite good or what you don't like isn't very important. So, I'm grateful to Cynthia for mentioning that, because that is a concrete illustration of what one might think of in terms of constitutional reform. There's also another website, what I'm thinking of, the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. 2 years ago, Jeff Rosen, who's the president of it, commissioned groups of liberals, conservatives, and libertarians, very small groups, 2 or 3 people, maybe 4 people, whereas our group had really 30 to 35 people who were fairly active throughout. But he commissioned these small groups of academics to draft new constitutions. They're available on the website of the National Constitution Center. And it's really quite interesting to compare the different takes that very self-conscious and smart libertarians or political conservatives or political progressives will suggest. And then the question is, can they in turn talk to one another? And, I would hope so. But right now, it isn't happening. The very last thing I would say, incidentally, is that although our book is written notionally for kids, my own hope is that it will be read as well by the grandparents, parents, aunts, uncles, brothers, and sisters. And I am either shameless or simply unashamed to assign it in classes that I've taught at the Harvard and Yale law schools, because frankly, it is the best book available that focuses on the structural features of the Constitution. Most books for kids, and for that matter, most books for adults, are about rights provisions. We're different. And Cynthia knows how to write not only for kids, but also we've been told by some parents and grandparents who have picked up the book that they actually got a lot from it as well.
I'm sure the only way that I could understand these issues is through a kid's book or a book written for kids. So this has been a pleasure. Talk about one of the neat things about this podcast is I get to spend time speaking with incredibly intelligent people that I never would have had a chance to meet in my life. So I really appreciate this day. We've had a really wonderful time speaking with Cynthia and Sanford Levinson. Please check out Fault Lines in the Constitution. It's available as in a narrative form and also as a graphic novel. Cynthia, Sandy, thanks so very much for being with us.
Thank you, Jed. It's been our pleasure.
Pleasure.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guests will be Pat Zietlow Miller and E. Charlton Trujillo. They'll be here to celebrate Lupe Lopez Rockstar Rules. That's the next episode of the podcast. Want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Chris, want to start by thanking our guests, Cynthia and Sanford Levinson. Be sure to pick up Fault Lines in the Constitution. Also want to thank Sarah Belisa Tucker. Be sure to check out The Adventures of Harry and Friends. My team, I think they deserve a big thank you. Rory Grady, Fatima Khan, Mirabella Q. My beautiful wife, she absolutely deserves a big thank you, as do you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.